Joining us to talk about all this is Ambassador Ira Shapiro, a former U.S. trade negotiator during the Clinton administration. He currently heads his own consulting firm specializing in U.S.-Japan relations, American politics, and international trade. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here.
We look at this Trans-Pacific Partnership, a great deal of controversy about this agreement. The White House, of course, pushing for it. A lot of people opposed to it. Why do you support it?
Well, if you look at what this agreement accomplishes, it really represents a major advance from what we have now. Go back just a few years ago, you find that the United States looked at the Asia-Pacific area and recognized it was integrating really without the United States. We were in danger of being excluded from the most dynamic region of the world. And President Obama, after the economic crisis eased, when he looked at the world, he said, we should be in the Asia-Pacific rather than outside of it, looking in. And this agreement accomplishes that. Along with 11 other nations, it brings down trade barriers, and it sets high standard rules of the sort that we were trying to find.
Well, let's talk about those high standard rules. Of course, as I said, there's opposition. Now, labor leaders, for instance, unions, are saying that it's going to be difficult to enforce some of these provisions. Let's look at an example. Let's say there's a worker in Vietnam that's working 70 hours a week, not being paid minimum wage, not getting annual leave or anything like that. How do you enforce that?
Well, it's not easy to always enforce these agreements. But the idea that Vietnam, with the situation, their economic situation, the idea that Vietnam would enter into an agreement that commits to the labor rights that we're committed to here is quite extraordinary. It represents a platform and lifts them up. And it becomes something that their government has to adhere to. It becomes a situation that the workers and the unions that form have a platform from which they can operate. The number of times that we will actually enforce that agreement is less important than the standards that are set and what happens from there.
At what point do governments start resisting an agreement like this when it affects their own interests? Let's say, for instance, internet access. Certain governments might say, look, no, we don't want this stuff getting around our country. We're going to block access.
Well, I think that certainly that's why this agreement took several years to negotiate. That's why countries that have different views about the internet, some of them are not part of this negotiation. The key here is, though, that 12 nations agreed to the notion that the internet should be open, that higher standards were what they wanted. There are opportunities to go in a different direction, but they declined to do that.
But if you enforce these higher standards, I mean, do you require some kind of a policing mechanism, some kind of body that oversees this and makes sure that these rules are observed?
Well, the agreement has in it dispute settlement mechanisms by which you enforce them. And, you know, that's something that the nations have agreed to. One of the things that puzzles me about the critics, they sometimes say, well, the United States is insisting on everything it wants. And the truth is, these are compromises in many areas, but they're compromises that are creating higher standards rather than lower.
I was looking at some of that criticism. The head of Democracy for America, that's a progressive group that is aligned with President Obama. The head of that group told the UK's Daily Mail newspaper that the TPP is a job killer, and he said this, quote, and we'll be seeing this on screen in a moment, would push down wages, flood our nation with unsafe imported food, raise the price of life-saving medicine, all the while trading with countries where gays and single mothers can be stoned to death.
Well, that's a pretty long sentence. And I think it overlooks a lot of the benefits that we get from TPP. I mean, look, the truth is there are barriers, high trade barriers throughout many of the nations that have joined this. We're bringing down the barriers to our agricultural products, industrial goods, and our services. We're setting high standards for intellectual property rules. We're coming in favor of an open internet. With respect to access to medicines, this was a carefully negotiated compromise, so that while the critic may have said that too much was given away, the pharmaceutical companies don't think they got enough. Compromise is what's involved in reaching these trade agreements. And I think we're going to have a vigorous debate in which the critics will be shown to be less convincing.
But should not that vigorous debate have taken place already? Because a lot of these negotiations were carried out in secret.
Well, I think, first of all, I don't agree with that. I think that there have been hundreds of people, advisors across the board, not just business, but labor and public interest advisors who have been close to this negotiation and understand everything that's been in this negotiation. Members of Congress have been consulted endlessly. And in fact, they had an opportunity. Each time another nation came in, they had 90 days to sort of register their concerns before those nations joined. So I think the idea that this is negotiated in secrecy is really an overstatement. The text is out there now. The text will be judged.
Let's look at the broader agreement, and you mentioned this at the outset. In recent years, the United States has talked about a pivot to Asia, and that's been seen as a military pivot. It's been called rebalancing, putting more ships and airplanes and guns in the Asia-Pacific region. How does TPP factor into this?
Well, I think it's crucial. The truth is, the president's notion of a rebalance to Asia has always been economic as well as security. And without TPP, we would be talking only about this notion of security. From the standpoint of the United States, we want to be involved in the Asia-Pacific region in a meaningful way, and that requires being involved economically. If you go back a few years, we were in a situation where we were in danger, as I said, of being excluded, and now that's not the case. And I think what's exciting about this, from my standpoint, is that nations are lining up to try to join the TPP even before it's completed. We have Korea, we have Thailand, the Philippines, the president of Indonesia was here recently. There's something going on that is an attractive model for the Asia-Pacific region, and one that we didn't have before.
What about China? Will China be a member of the TPP at some point? I mean, it is the biggest economy in the region.
Well, look, as from our standpoint, we would welcome China being part of the TPP if it can make the commitments that the other nations have made. I think China realistically is several years off from that. But I've been interested, and I'm sure you've noticed, that after Japan joined the TPP negotiation and the negotiation moved into the last phases, China has been shown increasing interest in it. The reformers in China look at it carefully and say, there may be a model here that's worthwhile for us as we shift from state-owned enterprises, an economy dominated by state-owned enterprises, to more private companies. So I think this will play out in a very interesting way. And from my standpoint, it's very useful to have competitive models, a competition going on. This is our concept of it, and China will decide whether it works for China.
That's right. China has proposed its own 16-nation free trade area, which includes India,
yes,
which would make it the world's biggest trading bloc. But was it a mistake to leave China out right at the beginning?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, we had started out as like-minded nations that had a concept of high standard trade agreement. China was not ready to enter into that kind of an agreement. I think over time, I hope they will be.
Now the agreement goes to the United States Congress for approval. There is opposition in Congress from both sides of the aisle. You have progressives on the Democratic side saying, this is not what we want, and you have Republicans saying it doesn't go far enough, it doesn't help the United States enough.
Must mean we're in the right place.
If both sides disagree, yes. But what are the chances for approval? And what happens if Congress gives it the thumbs down?
I think that we're going to have a very vigorous debate, and as you know, and the audience knows, we had a vigorous debate on the trade promotion authority needed for the president and the trade representative to finish the negotiation. Trade's controversial in all our countries, and it's certainly controversial in the United States. So we're sure to have a vigorous debate. But I'm quite confident that sometime in 2016, Congress will approve this. They will approve it because they think that it is in the national interest, because of the rules that it sets, because of the market access that it accomplishes, and because walking away from it would be quite inconceivable. I mean, think about it for a moment. If you tell 11 other nations, including several of your leading trading partners, well, we've negotiated this with you for several years, but actually we're killing it now. I don't think it's going to happen.
Now, what's the timeline for this agreement? Let's say Congress approves this in 2016. Is it all immediately implemented, or are provisions implemented in the years ahead?
Well, it depends on the provisions. I mean, a number of the provisions get phased in with respect to the market opening. Much of it happens right away, but some of it happens in stages. Other provisions for some of the lesser developed countries get a little more time as well. But generally, after it's approved, there's an entry into force, and then it will start taking effect.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.